welcome everybody. For those who have not met me yet, my name is Corey Buxton and I'm a professor of science education at Oregon State, and I'm the principal investigator of a new National Science Foundation funded grant at OSU, which is called LaCuKnoS. And LaCuKnoS is a partnership with the SMILE network, where we're going to be working sort of with the SMILE network in supporting you all and your students families in thinking together about three different strands or three pillars of science learning that sort of can support each other and think together about how these pillars work together. And this is actually the third of these kind of mini workshops / listening sessions that we've done. We did the first one on the first pillar, which is language development and how to think about the language of science. And we did a second workshop focused on culturally sustaining pedagogies and what it means to sort of think about cultural relevance in our science teaching. And the third pillar of LaCuKnoS is the idea of cumulative knowledge building in science, how we sort of put the puzzle pieces of science together. And that is the focus of our time together this afternoon. Next slide, Jay. Thanks. So LaCuKnoS stands for Language, Culture, and Knowledge Building Through Science, and it's a 4-year project, and we're actually in the first year, which is a planning year. So really this year is mostly about listening and learning and developing materials and developing some instruments, and then we're really kind of going to start the implementation of the LaCuKnoS project in the summer. But these mini workshops this year are just a chance for the LaCuKnoS team to start to get to know some of the SMILE teachers and vice versa, and for us to share some of our initial thinking about these ideas with you and get feedback. This is all kind of a work in progress, and the way we work very much is collaborative with teachers. It's not top down, it really is sort of a network. And so we want to think with you throughout the rest of this year so that we can design things that are going to be as effective for you as possible. So that's really the purpose of these workshops, is to share some initial stuff and get some feedback from you all. Next slide. So as I mentioned, LaCuKnoS overall has sort of 3 main focus areas, but of course these areas intersect. So we'll be talking about them separately sometimes, and other times we'll be thinking about how they integrate. And for any of you that have been at either of the first 2 mini workshops, you've seen kind of this slide before, but it sort of frames how we think about these 3 themes. So when we think about language development in LaCuKnoS, we're talking about how students use language to represent what they know about science, but also how we use language to represent who we are, our identities in connection to science. And so a big part of thinking about language in LaCuKnoS is sort of thinking about our purposes as producers and consumers of language, and how we kind of try to match our language with our purposes. And on the cultural side, it's been clearly documented, and any of us in education know that many of the students we teach don't see their cultures or their communities or their histories represented in science as it's typically presented in school. And LaCuKnoS wants to really help you all and help communities think about what is the role of science in communities, and thinking about sort of place and power and community knowledge and how that's relevant to science. And then the third strand, which is our focus today, is this idea of cumulative knowledge building, because we know that science understanding comes from connecting ideas, that loose pieces of science knowledge by themselves are not very useful. It's only when we can organize them into a sort of coherent framework that we can do things with the knowledge. And so we want in LaCuKnoS for students to learn to communicate and connect sort of evidence-based explanations about phenomenon, and also explore their own roles as knowers in science. Next slide. So like I said, this is a planning year. And so this year we're really developing tools and resources to use moving forward. And so some of these tools are about sort of making the role of language explicit and conscious. Teachers, but also for our students, we want to be more conscious about our language use in science. And it's also about sort of developing tools that will let us bring in cultural connections and practices to support students' interest and identity in science. And then on the knowledge building side, it's really about providing opportunities for students to build relationships between science ideas, but also to use science as a way to kind of build social relationships and strengthen their community and their student identities in ways that may help them be better students overall. Next slide. So this idea of cumulative knowledge building. So what is it and why does it matter? So most of us probably have heard this idea of learning progressions. It's an idea that's been around in science education for a while. And to me, that's kind of, I think of this as the traditional view of knowledge building, that learning progressions is this idea that standards ought to articulate across grades over time so that kids, learn the basics of sort of matter in elementary school, and then it builds into thinking about atoms and molecules as you go into middle school, and then you get into atomic theory, et cetera, as you move along the line. So that is kind of the traditional view of how we think about science building knowledge over time. And of course, that all matters. But in LaCuKnoS, we want to think about knowledge building a little bit differently. And to think about it, I think about it as thinking more sociologically about the nature of knowledge. And so when I think about knowledge building, and in LaCuKnoS, how I think we'll be thinking about knowledge building is that it's about how knowledge and knowers come to be accepted or come to be seen as legitimate. So science knowledge has to be accepted over time. New ideas aren't instantly accepted and taken up. Things have to happen that allows a new piece of scientific evidence or knowledge to be accepted. And all you have to do is think about the COVID vaccine to see a real clear example of if people don't accept it as legitimate, that has implications, right? If we do accept it as legitimate science, it has other implications. So that piece I think is very important, but also as knowers, how do we come to have our ideas be accepted over time? And this matters in the scientific community, but of course it also matters in the school community because some kids tend to feel like they get listened to when they talk and other kids tend to feel like maybe not so much. So a piece of what this cumulative knowledge building is about is how do we keep our sort of focus both on the knowledge and the role of knowers in relationship to that knowledge. Next slide. So how do we do this? So I want to talk briefly about two concrete ways to think about this, and then we'll have some sort of discussion questions, and then I'll show you a model lesson that maybe tries to put some of this into practice, and then we'll talk about this. So one way to think about this kind of cumulative knowledge building is to think about the shared experiences that kind of we can create for our students as the basis for the scientific knowledge that gets built upon and accepted in the learning spaces that sort of we control, our classrooms or our clubs, right? So we know that knowledge has to be organized into frameworks or storylines of some kind in order for it to be useful. And if we give students the right kinds of shared experiences, then we can help them to construct those storylines, and then they can sort of have a model for what it means to take sort of a phenomenon and reason about it and create kind of this story to explain what's going on. And so in science, we talk about sometimes anchoring events or discrepant events, some kind of aha, something that we might start off a unit or a lesson with that would require not just kind of one simple explanation, but multiple concepts over time to kind of get put together to fully explain something. And we need to give learners opportunities to sort of see how this happens, to see how science is pieced together over time. And there's always this rush in school. There's never enough time, right? We're always, as educators, we're always under the gun to move ahead, move ahead, move ahead. And we often fail to sort of slow down enough to help our students really put the pieces together. And we expect them to do a lot of that sort of somewhere else because there's no time to do it here. And yet that's super important. If we want the knowledge to be useful, we have to help students put it together. So that picture on the slide, the idea of bubble frames. So it's blurry, you probably can't tell, but it's a triangular prism with a triangle bubble inside. And so that's a great example of, we've got a lesson on bubbleology and using bubble frames to make bubbles in different shapes. And of course, everybody thinks that a bubble is going to be round. And so you show kids a square bubble, and that can provoke a lot of thinking, and there's a number of concepts you need to sort of understand in order to really fully explain, well, how do you get that square bubble in there? So this idea of kind of shared phenomena that we would manage together to create a space or a platform for our students to build these storylines is one important piece of knowledge building. And next slide. And then the other piece of this is kind of the social relation, right? So how can we build social relations through science specifically to support the knowledge building piece, right? So this is back to this idea of students' interest and identity. We know from the research that science interest and identity are tied to our sense of acceptance by others as legitimate science knowers. If I feel like I'm a competent science learner, then I'm going to be much more likely to participate, to volunteer, to fully engage. And if I hold myself as someone who is not a competent science learner, or my teacher doesn't see me that way, or my peers don't see me that way, then of course I'm much less likely to show up that way, right? We know that we all kind of embrace practices that align with our identities, and we resist practices that conflict with our identities. But of course, kids are still forming their identities. And so part of our job as science educators is helping all students hold a possible science identity, right? Not that we want everyone to go into science, but we want every kid to feel like it's open to them, right? That that identity is available to them. And so we need to give them opportunities where they can feel comfortable playing that role in order to then, be willing to take the risk to make that explanation, make that argument about how the pieces fit together. So, we can see how others have used knowledge to build social power and get their ideas heard. And that might help us to sort of think about, if I want to get my ideas heard, can I use science as a way to sort of to make my point? And so we're going to work with you all, to work with the students in the clubs, to think about science in this way. How can I use science as sort of a vehicle for getting my ideas out there? And sort of to make those connections. And so one way we can do that is the idea of scientist stories or scientist biographies, right? In terms of broadening participation in science, one of the issues with science is, do we see ourselves represented, right? And is science even seen as something that people do, or is it just a body of knowledge out there? So one of the tools that we use are sort of trade books or scientist storybooks. So we've got Annie Jump Cannon here. We've got a big collection of these that we'll be linking to some of the lessons. For a long time, I've been sort of collecting scientist biographies because I feel like in textbooks, the scientists are often missing. The science got done and now it's reported as knowledge, but we really want to show the work of scientists. And so scientist stories can do a couple things for us. They can highlight characteristics of scientists. Like, we tend to have some stereotypical characteristics that scientists are often nerdy and old white men in glasses and lab coats who are crazy and blow things up, right? And so there's lots of other characteristics, though, of successful scientists. And so books about actual scientists doing their work can highlight other characteristics. Of course, it can also highlight the broader range of work that scientists do. Work that I've done with middle school kids and their families, often families have a pretty narrow view of the range of science careers that exist. And through broadening, using scientist stories, we can broaden the idea of what counts as science, the range of sciences that are out there. And then also, of course, the range of people who do science and the settings in which science takes place. So scientist stories are one tool that we can use to help bring in that identity and interest piece and make kids feel a little more comfortable about bringing their ideas to the table. So that was a whole lot of talking about this idea of cumulative knowledge building in science. And like I said, we really want to hear from you and chat with you about these ideas, what you're already doing in line with some of these ideas, and then how we can create resources for you this year that you can use moving forward that will help you to help your kids be more effective science learners. So what we're going to do in a minute is Jay will give us some directions about how we're going to organize ourselves, but we're going to talk about a couple of questions, and really, we really just want to hear from you all about, how you're thinking about these things. So first question is, what do you already do? How do you help your students to organize and connect ideas, to sort of create science frameworks of understanding or storylines? You're already doing things, of course, that help your students do that. So how do you think about that? What do you already try to do to help your kids put the pieces together? And then secondly, how do you help your students already to feel more connected to science themselves, that sort of identity and interest piece, to see themselves as science knowers? What do you already try to do, or what ideas do you have, things that you'd like to try to do to try to help your students feel more connected? And then finally, trying to think about specific topics that might be good topics to sort of support some of these connections or do some of this work. So if there are specific science topics that you have used either to help kids create storylines or to help kids feel connected, we would love to hear some of those examples so that we can learn from you. I'll be quiet now.
So I put in the chat, if you haven't seen it, that is a link to a Google Doc that we'll all be working on that has these 3 questions on it. We're going to separate into 2 breakout rooms, and we're going to talk about these questions. We'll be in the breakout rooms for about 19 minutes. So this is an opportunity for you to share your experiences in your class and with your students, and to help us sort of understand what you all are doing. So I'm going to move you into your breakouts, and we'll see you back here in about 19 minutes. Oh, welcome back from the breakouts. Hopefully that was a productive discussion for you. And again, I was letting the group I was with know that we're really appreciative to your willingness to engage in these sorts of discussions with us. Now, what you're probably likely here for is the lesson that is associated with this. And Corey, you want to introduce that? And
Sure.
I can get it pulled up. Just let me know when you're ready.
Yeah, if you want to go to the next slide there just for a minute. Yeah, so thanks, Jay. Yeah, and our group had a great conversation too. We super appreciate people's willingness to brainstorm. And like I said, this really, the purpose of the planning year is to be throwing some things out there to share, but then listening back and hearing about your needs and trying to figure out how we can use this project to provide you all with sort of resources and ideas that are going to help us all support science learning in Oregon. So one of the things we talked about in our group was the sort of frustration the kids are feeling this year with not being able to do hands-on activities and labs, and that some virtual labs are great and some virtual labs can really be effective, but we really want kids sort of doing stuff with their hands. And so we talked a little bit about the kind of very simple materials activities that it's possible the kids can scavenge at home, or that we could send things to them that would just be the most sort of material light kinds of activities that we could do. So I was thinking about this one on the expanding universe, because really all it involves, all you need is really one balloon and a Sharpie marker and a ruler and a piece of string or a tape measure. But I thought I would share this model activity just to highlight a few of the kind of strategies or pieces that we're working on building into lessons for LaCuKnoS. And some of this is built on an earlier project that I was involved in Georgia. And so we've been taking some of those resources and trying to modify them and make them appropriate for LaCuKnoS. And so the activities that we've been sharing in these mini lessons are examples of those. And we're still in the process of continuing to revise them for this project, but they still seem worth sharing. And so the one today is sort of about the Big Bang or the expanding universe, and it's a simple model to sort of highlight this idea that what does it mean that things are expanding in all directions. And Jay, I guess if you could change to the handout.
So let me know if you can't see that.
We can see it, but we're at the end of it, so you got to scroll all the way to the beginning.
Sorry.
No worries. Can people see that? I can see that, so I assume everybody else can see it. So those of you that were at either of the other mini workshops we've done have been introduced to this idea of a language booster. And the language boosters are kind of one page, pretty short, short readings that basically introduce students to whatever kind of the main topic of the activity is. It also introduces some sort of key vocabulary and science concepts. And it is also meant to have kids sort of do some things with the language of science. So our workshop today is not focused on the language sort of strand of LaCuKnoS, but the language booster is one of the ways we connect ideas about language to this idea of building knowledge, because it is also obviously providing some of the background knowledge that students will need to engage in the activity. And of course, as you all know, as science educators, we have this tension in our field about how much pre-teaching we want to do before we do an activity. To what degree do you want to just sort of throw kids into an experience and have them just sort of puzzle about it? To what degree do you want to give them some background knowledge that is going to help them make sense of it? And then how much is too much? We settled with teachers on the prior project on this idea that some prior knowledge was probably good, but not too much. And using these kind of short, hopefully high interest language boosters would prompt some of the prior knowledge, bring out some of the prior knowledge, give some new knowledge, and give an opportunity to talk a little bit about language if you wanted to do that, which we're not going to focus on today. But that language booster is about Hubble's work on trying to understand sort of redshift in the observations he was making, and how he came to how he gained the insight that this sort of redshift was actually caused by things moving away very quickly, right? And I also mentioned it's not in this language booster, I need to put it in. We were talking in our breakout group about becoming more conscious of who we put forward to sort of represent science, that putting scientists forward at all to sort of say science isn't disembodied knowledge, but it comes from people doing stuff, but also who do we sort of put forward to represent science? And of course, traditionally, for many reasons, it has tended to be white men that get put forward. And of course, in this language booster, it is Hubble who fits that description. But we also have folks like Annie Jump Cannon, who did a lot of important work related to understanding sort of redshift and how stars, the heat that stars give off is an important signature for how we identify stars. And so this idea of using scientist stories, there's the language booster, but then you can also use books like this to sort of, that are focused on the concepts, but also provide an opportunity to talk about broadening participation and sort of who gets to get represented as sort of the face and the voice of science. We haven't talked about sharing these scientist storybooks, but I think that's one thing we will try to do with LaCuKnoS. One nice thing about having a grant is we got money to buy stuff, and I love scientist stories. So if people are interested in that, that is certainly something that we can provide. Another thing you'll see always in these LaCuKnoS handouts is a lot of opportunity for think, pair, shared kind of turn and talk work. Every language booster always ends with sort of a request for students to partner up or small group up and do some reflecting on sort of prior knowledge, but also looking ahead knowledge based on what they read and thinking about what they're going to be doing. So in this case, they get introduced to the idea that they're going to be thinking about the universe and using a balloon to do it, and ask them to think about characteristics of a balloon that might be useful for this, and then getting them to sort of think about the reading a little bit more and reflect on how Hubble was able to come up with an age of the universe based on just looking at stars. So that's kind of the language framing, and then the lessons always have a hands-on component and sort of standard materials and procedures. In this case, it is a very simple activity that's a model basically to represent what Hubble found out. And so we use sort of a series of balloons. It's very simple. Basically, you do a balloon that's a little bit inflated, and you put some stars on it and you number them, and then you measure the distance from star number 1 to all the other. I did 10 dots on my balloon, and so I'm going to measure, we'll show you the data table, very simple data table in a little bit, but you're basically going to just sort of measure the distances between the stars on the balloon at time point 1, and then you're going to blow up your balloon a little bit more, and then you're going to repeat measuring the distance between the stars. And of course, as the balloon gets bigger, students ought to pretty quickly recognize that not only are some points moving away from other points, but all points are actually moving away from all other points. And then you do a third time point, you blow up the balloon a little bit more, and you repeat, and you can see that it isn't just that some things are moving away from other things. And this is, if you think about it, it's sort of based on where we stand on Earth. It's hard to think about everything moving away from everything else. It's sort of common sense is if you're moving away from some things, you're moving towards other things. And if the stars are all moving, it is common sense that some of them ought to be getting closer together if others are getting apart. But in fact, that isn't, what the evidence shows. In fact, everything is moving away from everything else. And that, of course, was sort of Hubble's insight that the only way that that would be possible is if everything started off in the same place and something happened to sort of send it all flying out in every direction. And that's sort of the only scenario that accounts for the data you find that everything, all the stars are moving away from all the other stars. Let's scroll down a little bit. And so most of our activities have some sort of very simple data collection. In this case, it's just a table where they're sort of repeating measures, and then they're finding the differences between balloon 1 and balloon 2, and then balloon 2 and balloon 3. And they can very easily, they'll see the pattern. When I did it before, they don't, not every dot, it's not always regular movement at the same rate away in every direction, but every dot is moving away from every other dot. But because balloons are balloons, they're not exactly spheres. And so one thing that kids will notice is it isn't necessarily a regular rate in all cases. And then they can do some exploring to see, well, in the universe, is it regular? Is it just that we've got a balloon? Or is it actually that there's things about the universe that make it not a perfect sphere either? But some basic data collection, and then always, again, some group or paired reflection on trying to put the pieces together, right? So what patterns do you see? And then how do the patterns in the balloons relate to the question of the universe expanding? And then sort of a hypothetical, if red is what happens when things are moving farther and farther apart, what might happen to objects that move closer to you? And of course, it blue shifts. And of course, this is also connected to the Doppler effect with sound. So I'll often start this activity, playing an audio of a fire truck going by or a race car going by, and talking about how the sound shifts as you hear it going by because of the speed. And the same thing that happens with sound is the same thing that happens with light when you have a balloon. When you have the expanding universe. And then finally, keep going. We always, we'll be modifying this a little bit, but this idea that what we call sort of the lab notes, which highlights, again, trying to put the pieces together. So this is kind of the cumulative knowledge building piece, asking some real targeted questions to sort of think about what is the main concept, and then what's the model, and how does the model relate to the concept. And then again, other ways of asking. We sort of tend to ask questions different ways, and sometimes kids are like, you ask us to do a lot of writing, but we became totally convinced, and the teachers that we worked with became totally convinced that getting kids to put their ideas down on paper was really essential for this cumulative knowledge building piece. And so really forcing them to sort of think together and then write something down and then talk about it, even though it can be pulling teeth sometimes, it really is, I think, a critical piece of the knowledge building to be putting those ideas down on paper. And then finally, super briefly, if you keep going, then we have our concept cards, which are, these are tied back to the initial little story, the language booster. And these are sort of, what are the big ideas? We do them bilingually or sometimes more than bilingually. And the idea is to really focus on kid-friendly definitions. Kids get really frustrated by glossaries where they look up a word and they don't understand what's in the glossary. So really trying to think about clear kid-friendly definitions with multimodal illustrations and bilingual to try to hopefully help kids really take ownership of these key concept words, that it's not about just recognizing them, it's about being able to use them. And I want to hear the kids actually using and making sense of the concept words. So those are kind of some of the key features and pieces of our LaCuKnoS model that we're still working on revising. But at this point, we would love to get a little feedback from you. We're getting close to the end of time here. So I guess, Jay, if we go back to the next slide. So are we going to do breakout groups, or are we just going to stay together, Jay? Because we're short on time, I guess. Oh, you're muted. Probably not breakout groups, just whole group. You're still muted.
Ken put a really good one in the chat, and he said that it's a really good example to focus on NGSS standards related to the use of models.
Awesome.
It's a simple enough model to do some reflection on how models work, limitation of models, value of models, etc. So
Nice.
I agree with that. Good job, Ken.
Thanks, Ken. That's an awesome comment. So yeah, please feel free to type in chat or just share out loud any other thoughts on any of the pieces of this lesson, or just any reflections on this idea of using lessons to try to help kids put knowledge pieces together.
I thought it would have a great like aha value, where as they make the balloon bigger and bigger, like that pattern will emerge, and it's, you know, they get to discover it for themselves.
So this is really one where you could have them do the activity before the language booster and really make it more of a discovery based, because it is a fairly clear thing that they are being asked to discover. Other thoughts or reflections or any takeaways? I'd love to hear anything you're taking away from today's session that you may be still thinking about or wanting to do something with or reflect on.
I like this a lot. I've seen this model before, but you're showing it in this way makes me want to use it. I'm trying to struggle with where it's going to fit in with other things I teach, because I don't teach any astronomy. I do sometimes teach the Doppler effect in physical science, and I usually put that into the sound unit. Yeah, you know, I'm teaching physics this semester, and we do sometimes get to the Doppler effect related to light. And so it may be something that the physics students would benefit seeing as well. It's a nice application for that.
Nice, and I'd love to think about what a high school version would sort of look like that would connect more to the physics.
Yeah, I mean, they plug in the numbers and they do the calculations to see what wavelength of light would you see in this circumstance, but who cares? Why does it matter? Well, this is what's going on, right?
Yeah, right.
And just to bring it down to the other side of the spectrum, hey, can I steal that balloon idea like immediately?
Sure.
Because this is going to really solidify it for my sixth graders when we talk about the expanding universe. And I can say it all I want, and I can try to describe it all I want, but the visual that I just played in my head watching this lesson, we're going to have an aha moment.
Great.
And nothing gives me goosebumps more than that aha moment. So this is perfect.
Wonderful.
And this lesson is, you know, you probably don't need us to provide you materials for it, but you will be getting materials for it. We just sent out a box today that will be reaching you very soon, but there'll be another one that goes out probably a week or 2 weeks after the winter workshop on January 30th. this will be included, again, packaged in a way that it's for individualized students instead of for a whole club. But again, really simple materials and something that students can basically build a model and test that model out at home, and do it a lot of different times. I mean, talk about, you know, we were working on the radish seed lesson that some of you may have done. We're looking on replicates. I mean, you could sort of repeat this over and over and get similar or same results. So I think that's another really good exemplar of models that students could be doing if you are in virtual, like many of us are. So we're coming up on the end of the hour. I just want to thank everybody for coming. Again, you are going to be getting materials. We also will be putting this lesson plan, a recording, edited recording of this session, as well as the presentation up on our virtual professional development page on the pre-college programs page. I'm going to put a link to that down below. I'm going to give also a plug for another PD that we have tomorrow. They're coming fast and furious, folks. We have one that has I think something that may interest some of you. There's going to be an RET research for teachers. And if you are interested in going out and learning more about bighorn sheep and doing some population genetics around bighorn sheep, we're going to have some opportunities for teachers, specifically at the middle and high school level. But if you're an interested elementary teacher, I would encourage you to come as well. And we're going to be learning more about bighorn sheep and some of the research that's going on in the vet school at OSU tomorrow, same time, different place. I sent out an email earlier today with that link. Hopefully we'll see you there. With that, thank you very much for coming, and looking forward to seeing you tomorrow, and if not tomorrow, on the 30th.
Thanks, everybody. Really appreciate you showing up at the end of a long day.
And if anybody has any specific questions, feel free to stay on. I will be here.